He survived in a sarlacc pit, crawled his way out, flamethrowered his way out, crawled through the desert, survived traumatic events with the Sand People. He killed the Type 2 diabetic Bib Fortuna. He took over the greatest Tatooine empire that any space slug crime boss could ever aspire to control. That's right, I'm talking about Boba Fett. Specifically, the Book of Boba Fett, Season 1, Chapter 2. I really enjoyed the first 2 episodes so far in the Book of Boba Fett, and what I think is really interesting is that the character is still mysterious and written in the legacy of a true Western anti-hero. I think Boba Fett may very well go on to found his empire, but also to expand his territory, mainly by using his experiences that you're getting flashbacks of in this first season with the Tusken Raiders, but mainly going and using his connection and his competitive edge, if you wanted to call it, to carve out something vastly different than has been seen on Tatooine before, something that's more of a federation of united tribes, almost like something like in world history, something like what Genghis Khan did in Mongolia. So the thing is that I don't know where the connections really end. Does Genghis Khan really have any real influences here, or am I just drawing into it? I'm not exactly sure yet, and I couldn't say. But what I am saying is that I think some interesting things are planned in terms of Boba Fett branching out and doing things that haven't really been done on Tatooine, at least as far as has been seen in canon so far. Additionally, he might be founding sort of a more hereditary undertaking. He might even be using clone technology later on. Probably not in season 1, maybe in season 2, just to make clones of himself. I'm not sure yet, but that would be cool. I think he could utilize different technologies to sort of unify Tatooine. He's already sort of in the flashbacks done some interesting stuff like that, where he uses the speeders that he takes to teach the native peoples, like the Tusken Raiders, how to raid the train. And what I think is interesting here is there's several sort of references that I'd like to go over that I'm sort of caught on to. And one of those is the Fremen and Dune. And so the differences between these people that live in the desert in Frank Herbert's world versus this one is that the Tusken Raiders don't seem to be worried about water as much, and they don't have a bunch of underground caverns that we've seen. But for the most part, they ride creatures in the desert, very similar. They are against the capitalist and, say, other very different organized groups, and they have their own way of doing things. I guess the Tusken Raiders have their own completely different language. Majority of them don't speak any sort of basic or anything like that, right? So, but very similar. And so I wonder if it's going to be sort of an alliance between Boba Fett's organization and the Tusken Raiders, starting with the small group or tribe that he's dealt with. His dealings with these groups also reminds me of Dancing with Wolves. There's another Western. For those of you that don't know, the Dancing with Wolves movie is like a movie about pretty much a captain who's stationed to a remote outpost in California right after the Civil War, and he sort of starts to integrate with local Native American tribe. And it's pretty similar in that Boba Fett is kidnapped rather than has like free time and is bored and stumbles on a tribe. It's kind of different in that sense. Boba Fett's a little more extreme and amplified, and so yeah, he's also a warrior, and so a lot of things are happening quicker, and it's a more extreme example of that. But I think it has its roots in like a classic Western such as that. And I think it could also be a potential precursor to full-scale wars. Again, as I mentioned, I think there could be a potential alliance. He already sort of set something up at the end of episode 2, chapter 2 there, where the Pikes are going to try and, he's going to work something out with the Pikes where they end up paying the Tusken Raiders. Another thing is that the Bantha herds, similar to the bison in the plains, teaching modern skills and tactics like taking the destructive tech that disturbs their way of life, kind of using it against the people that they feel destroy their way of life. This is kind of similar. They do hunting rituals in Dancing with Wolves, and so this is a similarity. There's a ritual around the fire, which, I mean, is kind of almost direct plagiarism, it seems like, at a certain point. There's also another, like, random scene on the train where they break open this compartment and it just floods with water. That's, like, the one that comes to mind is from Rango, which is just like an animated Western, which is kind of silly, but various Westerns, I think there's just a big association with water, and I think this is one of them. You know, even in Dune, it's like there's a big rain at the end, kind of, and it's just like somehow water in the desert is just a big symbol. So you could also say Hidalgo as well. There's like water's a big theme because it's the lacking of water, so seeing a lot of water in the desert is like a miraculous event, and it's sort of a divine image in the context of the desert. And so it's interesting, possible parallel. Boba Fett went on a spirit quest, with the crazy Space Lizard guide, but Crazy Horse and various other Native American peoples would have done similar things. But regardless, it's he ends up getting part of his staff made with the Tusken Raiders helping him, and so it's almost like a Western version of how it's made, featuring the Tusken Raiders and Boba Fett. It's an interesting sort of mishmash there. The train actually had an old pod racing engine on it too, which I thought I'd mention. It's pretty awesome. And dealing with the Pikes could definitely mean the rest of the terms for season 1. The Pikes, I don't know if you guys are familiar or not, but were sort of one of the backbone elements of Darth Maul's, or I guess he was just Maul at that point, his criminal empire syndicate. And they had pretty good roots even later into the second iteration, or possibly third, we don't know exactly, iteration of his criminal empire, which became Crimson Dawn when he co-opted control from it. I think Boba Fett, the Book of Boba Fett, has some stellar potential to showcase the Underworld Syndicate beyond what was featured in, say, Poe Dameron comics, solo film, Mandalorian Season 1, Season 2, Star Wars Resistance, and even briefly in the Star Wars sequels films. I think this could be an interesting new take on what worked and what made the most sense in canon material and extended universe content. I think a lot of this new stuff with Boba Fett sort of gives an excuse to make it a little bit darker, but also potentially tell stories a little bit different. Star Wars is usually like, a lot of it, at least in the last couple years I've noticed, is like kind of pulling punches fiction in the sense that it's almost written for kids, and it's just a chance to tell stories with a lot of limitations on it. I think Boba Fett is kind of inching away from that, which is nice. We also see a really dangerous Wookiee bounty hunter. I'm really interested about that, and this is like a super interesting moment from Dr. Aphra Comics. I don't want to give away too much, but yeah, brutal bounty hunter, and I'm sure Boba Fett knows all about this one. And so if it gets real nasty, it could be a Boba Fett versus a really sort of cunning adversary. And I think another thing that might work, I think, in Boba Fett Season 1, the Book of Boba Fett Season 1, is that Boba Fett is sort of, instead of in the EU where he becomes the Mandalore, is this is kind of being transferred into the Mandalorian Season 3, in the sense that this struggle conflict, whatever happens, isn't playing out with Boba Fett. He might even make an appearance. He might fund some weapons or something, but he's probably not going to end up the Mandalore. He's like excluded from that conflict, which makes a lot of sense. For those that have read the EU, I'd rather not hash that out again. It was weird and strange to me. At least here, they're referencing the fact that he was a bounty hunter. In the EU material, they're conscious of what happened, but they just kind of went rogue with things. Didn't make a lot of sense. And so I'm glad to see something different and something sort of creative and new. Whereas the Crime World arcs now are split into the Book of Boba Fett, and I really enjoy that much more. These storytelling set pieces hopefully will feature heavily into preludes in, say, Solo or Star Wars The Clone Wars, because one of my favorite episodes from Star Wars The Clone Wars, where Maul is founding these different criminal elements into a criminal syndicate, and he's sort of taking over Mandalore, and it's just kind of a backdrop of shadowy happenings. It's very interesting. This is happening here away from Mandalore, and it makes more sense, at least in Hutt space, that, multiple governments in the past in Star Wars just kind of let the Hutts kill each other. So here he's kind of in former Hutt territory. Pikes are involved, and there's plenty of adversaries for Season 1, and I really enjoy, different things like how the mayor is difficult, and how he's going to have to overcome different limitations in, like, local government. He gets to know twins, so I'm interested to see how that plays out. I also find that criminal establishment will take many years to be fully established, and there's always, kind of like Peaky Blinders, I don't know if anyone's watched that, but there's always problems, there's always things to be solved. Very interesting story set pieces, and it makes complete sense that there would be tons of problems in a halfway legitimate, semi-legitimate, mostly illegitimate business that's in multiple places. In Peaky Blinders it's kind of international, but Tatooine, you start founding these intergalactic trade routes, and you start dealing with criminal elements all over the galaxy, and so there's never a point at which there won't be more rebellions or people to crush. And it's interesting because Boba Fett says from the get-go, almost like out of Machiavelli, it's like a weird portrait of what could happen. He says, I want to rule with honor, Jabba rule with fear. And it's like, well, that's nice to say, but I don't know how he's going to do that. He maybe wants to be an honorable person and be in charge of honorable people, but his line of work is particularly dishonorable. And the reason I mentioned Machiavelli is because it just seems sort of like a critique on Machiavelli, where he's trying to say, I know that I can rule a certain way, but it's just strange. I don't know how many times he's really ruled in his life. If he has the sort of specific skills in place in order to do what he says that he's going to do. And so I think it'll just be an interesting meeting of what he thinks will happen versus what will actually happen. And I'm interested to see it play out. Regardless, I think that probably the last thing that I thought was interesting is that Boba Fett keeps making entrances just on foot, and he keeps just acting like a bounty bounty hunter, and I wonder if, to gain legitimacy and act with honor like he seems to want to do, if he will ever have to succumb to Tatooine customs, like using a litter or that sort of thing. It'd be interesting to see if that really changes or not, because Boba Fett really, he kind of does what he wants, but he's changed already from sort of what we've seen before to now, as evidenced by his extensive time in the Bacta tank. He's trying to heal from his experiences in the desert. But I find it interesting that his healing in the Bacta tank never offsets his healing mentally, and so he maybe in that time in the Bacta tank is just showing that there are scars that can't be seen, but the ones that are healing don't in any way indicate that his mental scars will ever heal. That's something interesting that I think they sneaked in. They did well. And lastly, I hope you kind of enjoyed some of these thoughts, and I'm really interested to see how the rest of the season progresses in terms of Boba Fett becoming more of a Western anti-hero. I never really considered him to be that, but it really seems like that's what they're tripling down on. And it makes sense he had spurs. I just never thought of him like that, more like a outlaw sort of gunslinger. At any rate, I'm interested to see what happens, and I hope you are too. I appreciate you watching and listening and being a part of the channel, and look forward to seeing you next time.